Hello friends! Today you will be watching another fantastic attacking game. White is sacrificing a pawn and then detains black's king in the center by means of the fantastic bishop h6 device. When producing this video, I thought to myself, why not also creating an opening overview so it will attract a wider range of spectators. So this video also answers the question what to play against the Steinitz Deferred and what not. So let's start. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. 90% of you will know this is the Spanish opening or the Ruy Lopez. Now d6 would be the Steinitz variation. This is important to know because we are dealing with this deferred Steinitz. Instead of playing d6, black played the main move a6. White answered with bishop a4, knight f6, castles, and now black played d6. The normal move, by the way, would be bishop e7, and then, for instance, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, d6. This is a typical closed Spanish main line. But in this game, black opted for the deferred Steinitz. So it is the move d6 without b5. And deferred means he played a6 and also knight f6 before playing this d6 move. Now white has a wide range of choices. For instance, could he play rook e1? This would lead to the main line b5, bishop b3, bishop e7, c3, the main closed Spanish tabia. Another white option, and maybe the best move here, is c3. White is leaving the pawn e4 unprotected, as you see. The idea is that if black now tries to do the normal stuff, b5, the bishop would go to c2, defending the e-pawn outright, and now white wouldn't have to bother defending the pawn with rook e1. No, he could just play d4 next move. So white has a distinct advantage here in this position. After c3, bishop e7 instead of b5, white will play d4, castles, rook e1, with a slight advantage. That is good for white. So let's have a look now at knight takes e4. Of course, taking a gambit pawn is always a critical approach. Did we just lose a pawn for nothing? I hope not. Let's see. d4. Of course, white has a Latin development while black's king is still stuck in the center, and now white is threatening to win the knight with d5. In this case, b5 wouldn't help as an answer to that, because after bishop c2, the bishop would also attack the knight on e4, while the c6 knight still would be on fire. That means that black has to react to this threat d5. He could play b5, but that is a bad idea. Bishop b3. The main threat now is the move bishop to d5 with a skewer or a double attack on the two knights. If black retreats the exposed knight e4 to f6, white would win by knight g5. The pawn f7 now is under attack, and black has no way to solve that problem sufficiently. After bishop b3, bishop b7 could be considered protecting the knight c6. But now after queen e2, d5, and d takes e5, we see a position very similar to the open Spanish, where white has some advantages. So this is actually a clear advantage to white. It's a better form of the common open Spanish. So white is now prepared to follow up with rook d1 when the d5 pawn would be under attack. What can black do after d4? The best move, I guess, is bishop d7, just unpinning the knight. Rook e1. Now there are two moves to consider. f5, keeping the knight in the center. Then we would take on e5, takes knight bd2. We want to get rid of this knight e4 in order to activate the rook down the e file. Knight takes d2, knight e5, an intermediate move, leaving white with a clearly better position. This looks a bit threatening, right? This rook-king opposition in the e-file. Typical motive in the Spanish. Now, after rook e1, the more solid move is knight f6. Then, of course, we can win back the pawn by bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, takes. Yeah, the king has to take, because after rook takes d8, knight takes e5, there would be a discovered check threatening. So white just or black just removes the king directly away from the e-file. Now white takes on e5, threatening, of course, knight takes f7 with a fork against the king and the rook. So bishop d5, and now after bishop g5, white has a slight advantage. Black has a bishop pair, that is true, but the king d8 is placed in a very uncomfortable spot, and black's piece coordination is quite lousy. So white is doing fine here. This is what I would play against the Spanish Deferred. But now look, or against the Steinitz Deferred of the Spanish opening. That's the correct terminology. So after d6, white in this game neither played rook e1, nor did he play c3. He captured on c6, which is a playable move, but I think it might not be the best option. Black takes back with a pawn, of course, and now we saw white playing d4, the normal move here, but also not the best. White can mark a slight advantage by playing the better move, rook e1. The idea is, after bishop e7, which would be black's normal reaction, to play d4 then, and only then, because now after e takes d4, knight d4, black cannot play c5 as in the game, because now after knight c6, white will be able to capture the bishop. As you will see in our game, the bishop will still be on f8, so there is no bishop to be captured on e7. So we have to wait until black plays his bishop to e7 before we play d4. For this reason, white has just to calculate with black playing bishop d7 here, as c5 doesn't work. Now after c4, the engine says that white is slightly better. White has some nice space advantage here, and this is a very attractive position for white, without doubt. After rook e1, there is one move we have to consider, which could put this move rook e1 into a bad light, but as we will see, it doesn't. So move c5, just preventing white from playing d4. We mustn't forget that black has the two bishops. We gave up the bishop pair as white, and now we have to show something for that, right? And now if we cannot play d4, that would be bad, but we can actually. We can prepare it by c3. Now what can black do? One move would be bishop e7, so now we play our move d4, cd4, c4, the e5 pawn hangs, so black has to take. Knight d4, again, there's the threat of knight c6. We have the better pawn structure here, because we as white, we have only two pawn islands. You see the small one here on the queen side, and then the 4-pawn island, while black has 3 pawn islands. You won't have as few as possible, actually, because every pawn island is a potential weakness. So we have an isolated a6 pawn, and we have these 2 pawns here, c7, d6, which are exposed down the 2 semi-open files here. White can place his rook on the c file, and in case black should play c7, c5 in order to strengthen his c-pawn, the d6 pawn would then be weak. It would be a backward pawn. So this pawn structure there in the middle is quite fragile. So if black, who now has the two bishops as kind of a compensation, is losing the bishop pair by allowing knight c6 followed by knight takes e7, he would be left without compensation. So bishop d7 is mandatory. But after knight c3, white still enjoys a slight advantage because he has the better pawn structure and some space advantage on top. Another move after c3 would be a bishop g4 in order to fight for the square d4. But white can play d4 anyways. Takes, takes, takes. Now the queen has to take as the knight is pinned. And black can actually disrupt white's kingside pawn structure, but that is not too much of a problem because black is in no position to attack white's king right now. After bishop e7, knight c3, castles, bishop f4, rook e8, rook ac1, white has some nice space advantage and play against the potentially weak pawn on c7, plus equal. Now let's go back to our game. After b takes c6, white played what most players here actually do, the move d4. This move was also played by high-ranking top-class players, 700 players. So it's not obvious that this is a mistake, but when I put this position under the microscope, I came to the conclusion that d4 is inaccurate. Now, after e takes d4, again there are two moves for white. Now white took with the knight. Let's have a close look on what happened if white took with his queen. Bishop e7. Now again there are two moves. White can play with c4 and without. Okay, let's start without c4. Knight c3. Now black plays castles, bishop f4. It's the most active move for the bishop here. And now black equalizes with c5, queen d3. Queen d2 is also possible, but no improvement. a5, threatening bishop, a6, winning the exchange. So the rook has to move away. Now knight h5 is a strong move in order to expel white's bishop from the diagonal, because if white was to play, I think he would play a move like h3 followed by e5. That is a typical plan in order to disrupt black's central pawn structure. And if then knight h5, of course, the bishop could retreat to h2. But this is not possible right now after knight h5. Now the bishop could go to g3, but now black can get hold of this bishop. Let's say rook e8, rook a1, and now takes, takes, c6. And the engine gives equality here, because the d6 pawn is quite reliably defended by the bishop. The pawn c6 now takes away the square d5 from white's knight. And yeah, black has two bishops. White has no real good target to attack, as the d6 pawn is safeguarded, so the position is equal. Another option is not to give up the bishop f4 and to withdraw it to d2. Maybe leaving the knight on h5 looking a bit silly, but it's not really silly. Bishop a6 attacking the queen, queen e3, and now the knight can return. It did its job, because now the queen on e3 is a bit exposed. For instance, after rook d1, rook e8, black has some play on the e-file. He will maybe play bishop f8, the very next move, when the queen is a bit uncomfortable vis-a-vis black's rook. So here black again is sitting on his bishop pair and has some e-file pressure, compensating his doubled pawns and his little space disadvantage. Okay, now let's have a look at the second idea, playing with the pawn on c4 in order to grab more space. Black castles. knight c3, bishop g4, intending to take on f3. So the queen defends the knight, and black is taking anyways, and now plays the knight to d7. That is a very well-known regrouping of pieces. The knight now has two options later, two active options, while, and this is the main point of the move knight d7, it vacates the square f6 for the bishop. So now b3 would be a normal move, rook e8, bishop b2, bishop f6. Of course, that is a very active positioning of the bishop, rook a1, and now a5. And actually this is an equal position despite white having more space, because black has some activity making count for himself here. Because if you have a space advantage, you have also the obligation to defend the space. In this case, the pawn e4. It is a target. It is an asset, but at the same time, it also is an obligation. So black has some play against the pawn, can put his knight to c5, attacks the pawn another time. And then on the queen side, you see there's this potential pawn lever a5, a4. So black has actually right now the more active pieces, compensating for his lack of space and the double pawns. This is equal. That means that taking back with the queen on d4 is not convincing. Knight takes d4 is our move, and now comes c5. That is the point. This position was discussed on the highest level, 2600, 2700. Many good players advocated this with black, and the move c5 is very important, otherwise black would just stand quite passive. But now white's knight has to react. Now, by far the main move, it was played in 80 games at the time of now talking to you. The move knight c6, this was played in 80 games, this is the main line, while the game move knight f5 was only played in 8 games. Let's have a look at this knight c6 move. Queen d7, now knight a5. That is not a bad place. You know the rule, knight on the rim looks grim. But it's not always the case, because this knight is sitting on an outpost. It cannot be attacked by a pawn, and also is now controlling two squares here, c6, b7. The bishop cannot go to b7, and the knight can maybe go back to c6 if the queen is removed from d7. So let's have a look. If now black would make a mistake, bishop e7, now white can save the dominant position of his knight on a5 by controlling the square a4. So the better move is queen a4, but this is shown in a bit. After knight c3 castles, bishop f4, white is bringing out all his pieces. Black is very short of space. Let's say bishop d8, rook e1, c6, attacking the knight. Look, the knight is hanging now. So the knight has to move, but now the pawn is on fire here, the d pawn. So forced is d5. Now the knight goes to d6. This is quite an agile knight, isn't it? Knight d6, bishop c7, now e5. We can keep the knight there on d6. This is a clear advantage for white. So black has to play queen a4, immediately making sure that the knight on a4 is, let's say, contested, right? So now if the knight has to move away to b3, this would be a very passive square for the knight, and I just wonder whether black can take on e4, maybe not. Knight e4 looks dangerous, rook e1, bishop e7, I don't know, I don't think so, but having misplaced the knight on b3 is an achievement already. So black might just play bishop e7, and then the pawn e4 will be under attack later. So now white has to make sure that the knight remains on a5. Now there are two moves. We're now following a game Grischuk versus Kramnik. I told you this position was discussed in the highest echelon. So knight takes e4, question mark. So Kramnik was greedy here. Knight c3, attacking the queen, takes, bishop e6. And now the novelty f4 instead of queen f3 is actually winning for white. So the idea is to play f5, expelling the bishop from e6 and then attacking black's king down the e file. This is losing. So after bishop b2, black has to play differently. Bishop e7, that's the move. Rook e1, bishop g4, f3, bishop e6. So this is a critical position. I think this position is almost equal. For instance, queen c1 in order to play c4 without exchanging queens. Knight h5, c4 castles. And now after knight c3, the queen should not take the knight because white would take the bishop later, depriving black of his bishop pair. So after knight c3, the queen just retreats to d7. Bishop g5 in order to cut black's bishop pair into two halves. No, yeah, well, to halven the bishop pair, let's call it like this. To destroy the bishop pair. Why this mess? Let's be direct. f6, bishop h4, c6, bishop f2, bishop d8, attacking the knight has to move away, bishop c7, safeguarding the pawn, d6. G4 doesn't work, by the way. Now, if you thought why isn't white winning the knight with g4, well, the sacrifice is the answer. So this doesn't really work. Queen e3, and now g5. G4 was a threat with the queen now very close to white's king. But now after g5, the position is equal. Black has the two bishops, and white has a knight here on b3, which is quite passive. And also the c3 knight is kept at bay by black's c6 pawn. Okay, this was the line knight c6. That's the main line, and as we found out, it is equalizing for black. So this whole variation of taking here, the idea of taking on c6, is only good if you, after b takes c6, follow up with my improvement rook e1 instead of d4. Now let's go back to our position here after c5. In our game, the white player, he opted for knight f5. By the way, white is a German grandmaster, Leonid Kritz, and the black player, he was still very young when this game was played. This was a typical first round game of an open tournament where amateurs have the chance to meet grandmasters. So, knight f5, that is a very enterprising move because it entails a pawn sacrifice. Black could now take the pawn on e4, which he actually did, but which he shouldn't have done. Now, knight f5 is not really an improvement over a knight c6 because if black plays accurately, he can also equalize here. The right move now is d5. This was played in some games. For instance, in the following email game, Terzic against Haidt, 2019. d5. Of course, you cannot take on d5 with a pawn because of bishop takes f5. So bishop g5 is the move. Takes, bishop e7. Black tries to get his king castled. Knight c6. White is attacking the d5 pawn, which is defended by c6. Queen f3. And now after h6, takes, check, king f8. The position can be called equal. Black lost his right to castle, but can kind of castle by hand later. King g8, king h7, bringing the rook h8 into play. And the bishop f6 is quite a very strong minor piece, as you can see. Right? The bishop is better than white's knight. It is attacking the knight and also radiating towards the b pawn. And black has also kind of a strong center here. So white has to be careful. If black manages to unravel his position, he might be better, but white is to move, and I guess will now start a counter attack against black's queen side in order to use his lead of development. So this is an equal position. Now in the game, after knight f5, black was greedy and took on e4. Now the knight was attacked by queen d5, and so was the rook a8. So we have a nice double attack in place. But black could manage this problem easily by taking white's knight, defending the rook, queen takes f5, and now knight f6 was played. d5 wouldn't have been good. Well, it would have maybe be equally good, but it wouldn't have solved black's problems. After d5, white would play queen e5 check. And now he cannot play queen e7 because of queen takes d5. So you have to play bishop e7. Now queen takes g7, bishop f6 forced, queen h6. This position sees white having a structural advantage because black has many weak pawns. So this is an isolated pawn, that's an isolated pawn, that's an isolated pawn, and we have also doubled pawns. Yeah, this is what white is hoping for, exploiting black's bad pawn structure. But black's pieces are quite actively placed, so the game could unfold as follows. Queen d6 in order to castle queenside, as the king side is not a safe place for the king anymore, and of course right now black cannot castle on the level of the rules of the game. So knight e2 in order to open up the e-file, but black castles away in time. Takes, bishop f4, and this is plus equal. White has a slight advantage because black has a lot of weaknesses, but it's not that big of a disaster for black as his pieces are quite active. So d5 was an alternative, but not really better than knight f6. Okay, knight f6 happened, and now black threatens just to castle away into safety. White is behind a pawn and has to show something for that, of course. So what to do? Well, you might have guessed it. We now have our nice bishop h6 move coming into play. Bishop h6, the freezer is now being used. This prevents bishop e7, obviously, because after bishop e7 we could take the pawn on g7. So this is now the idea, and the threat is rook e1 check. Now there are four moves I offer you. The game move was queen d7, was not the best. Let's start with g takes h6. Now we check. Bishop e7 forced, but now we can take the knight. Here you see the tactical reason behind bishop h6. By deviating the pawn or by deflecting the pawn away from g7 to h6, the queen could now take on f6. The rook was under attack, so it has to move. Rook g8. Queen is taking the h-pawn. Queen d7. Queen is taking yet another pawn. And white is winning here. So white has a structural advantage and also a material one to add to this. What else can black play after bishop h6? Another move which is bad is rook g8. Now preparing bishop e7 by overprotecting the g7 pawn. But now we check. And now we destroy black's position with the same motive as we have seen just before. we want to undermine the f6 knight, which can now be taken. Queen f6, king f8, attacking the queen, queen f3, and white has now regained his pawn and can claim a clear advantage because black's structure is full of weaknesses, and also his piece coordination is not that good anymore. The rook g7 is right now not connected to the other rook, so there are some problems black has to solve. White has a clear advantage. The only good move after bishop h6 is actually queen c8. Okay, attacking the queen, we give a check, king d8, and now of course you cannot exchange queens because you are one pawn behind, so you have to go to f3 as white. Rook b8, occupying the open file, also disengaging black's queen from the need to protect the rook. Bishop g5, attacking the knight, bishop e7, defending that, knight c3, rook e8, because there was some pressure on the bishop e7, which was only protected by the king. Rook a1. Here the entry says that white is half a pawn ahead, despite having a minus pawn. But you see the problem of black. The king is stuck in the center, and this is a long-lasting problem, as there isn't really a good safe place for the king. So the only safe place would be g8, but the king in all likelihood will not pass the e-file anymore, will be stuck in the center. Then on the other hand, white has no direct way to breach black's position, but it's of course much more comfortable to play this position with white because black has to be very careful. For instance, can't he take there on b2? That would be just too greedy, opening the b file. Knight a4, let's say rook b4, knight c5, and of course now black's fortress is deprived, or has been deprived, of one pawn, and the king on d8 is in danger. This is a clear advantage now for white. Now let's go back to the game. After bishop h6, black played queen d7. Of course, clearing the square d8 for the king. White played queen f3, attacking the rook. Rook b8. Check. Of course, now he cannot play bishop e7 because, let's just move it quickly here. It's not possible. So the king has to step to the side. King d8. And now we have the same situation as just before. The king is now stuck in the center for quite some time, which gives white a long-term compensation for the pawn. Now comes a very good move, a very important one, h3. You might wonder, well, didn't white just sacrifice material? Why is he playing that slow? Well, this one thing is that even if you sacrifice something, that doesn't mean that you have now to rush in. There is actually no sense of pardon me, no sense of urgency here for white, because as I just mentioned before, white has long-term compensation for the pawn, and the king d8 is a problem. Black's pieces are badly coordinated for that reason, so white doesn't have to hurry. And the move h3 was very important because black had the idea to activate his queen. Queen g4 was a threat. We should not forget that the bishop h6 is depending on the queen being on f3. So queen g4 would actually have forced the exchange of queens, more or less. And of course that is something white cannot let happen, as he has sacrificed a pawn. His whole compensation hinges upon the presence of queens, so only the queens on the board make the king d8 feel insecure. So h3, it was necessary. Rook g8, preparing bishop e7 by overprotecting the g7 pawn. knight c3, bishop e7, there it comes. And now the bishop is under attack. Where to go with the bishop? In the game, white committed a slight mistake by playing bishop g5. The better move would have been bishop d5, bishop d2. Now, what can happen? Let's say you are greedy with black and take on b2, question mark. That's not good. Now the b file is ours. So you just lost the battle of the b file, and now there will be moves like queen a check to be reckoned with. So this is losing for black. He cannot do that to his king. So after bishop d2, rook e8 is a normal move, but now we play b3. That doesn't mean that rook takes b2 was an imminent threat, but in the long run this might be the case. So we save the pawn, but the main idea is to play the knight to a4. So actually the idea here is to improve the knight as follows: knight a4, knight b2, this pocket was newly created, knight c4, and then knight a5, and maybe finally knight c6. Improving pieces is of course one important part of chess strategy. So you have to ask yourself, where is the ideal square for a given piece? And white can improve his position by doing this knight maneuver, for instance. What can black do? If black is now a bit too active here in the center, white can kind of soften up black's position. White is very happy seeing black loosening his king's fortress so much. So that is very bad what black just did. Bishop f8, takes, check, bishop e7. Now after bishop g5 we see black is very soft here. White also can take here on f6, the very next move, forcing black to double his pawns. So white is clearly better. After b3, black should not play d5, as we just saw. King c8 is a much smarter move, playing the king a bit more towards safety. But there is no real safe place, as I mentioned before. Knight f4, and now yeah, we want to play knight b2, knight c4, bishop d8, takes, rook e1, and now bishop c3. White is clearly better here. The bishop is now active on the long diagonal, so the knight f6 is tied to that spot. Could maybe go to e8, but what does it want there? Cannot go somewhere else because the g7 pawn could be taken in case of doubt. And yeah, the rook is active on the e file, the queen is strong on the long diagonal, the bishop on the other one, the knight can go to c4. So white has a clear advantage, much more compensation than needed for the small price of a pawn. Now in the game, white played bishop g5, that was inferior, h6, and now white committed a mistake after which the game rendered irrelevant, unfortunately. So now the white should have played bishop takes f6, and bishop f6, knight d5, that's a nice square for the knight. The bishop cannot take the pawn, this would be suicide after rook e7, penetration. Knight e5, bishop g5, that's a better move. And now queen a3, attacking the a6 pawn, queen b5, rook a1. White is clearly better because black's king is unsafe, and the knight d5 is placed very strongly. So that would have been the logical continuation of white's efforts. So white played a nice game up to here and should have crowned his play by continuing with this variation. Instead of this, he played bishop h4, and this allowed black to play g5, bishop g3, and now instead of h5, which happened in the game, after which white was slightly better, Black could have played g4, h4, and now queen takes g4. So by playing this g4, g5, g5, g4, Black now could activate his queen, and White cannot exchange queens because he sacrificed a pawn. Queen e3, rook e8, defending the e7 bishop, rook 81, and now h5. Black gets some counterplay in the g5, so one idea might be playing h4 and then at some point returning with a rook and maybe then attacking the g2 pawn. This position is given as equal by the engine. As I mentioned before, the game now was irrelevant, but I liked the way White played the opening, and I hope you learned how to attack an opponent's king which is stuck in the center.